Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Farah Kotadia, the Program Director at AMSSA, and we are coming to you live from the AMSSA offices in Vancouver. Thank you for joining us for today's E-Symposium entitled Navigating Housing for Newcomers. We would like to thank our funder, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, for making this event possible today. So who are we? AMSSA is a provincial association of organizations focused on immigration settlement, integration and language, as well as diversity and inclusion. We are contracted by Immigration, Refugees Canada to support a broad range of immigrant and language service providers and stakeholders in BC. I'd like to provide you with a brief overview of today's event. With me in the room are three subject matter experts on this topic. The panelists are Andrew Sakamoto, Tenant Resource and Advisory Center, or TRAC, Dr. Carlos Texera, UBC Okanagan, and Elizabeth Lefrancois, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC. I would now like to welcome the presenters here with us. Our first presenter, Dr. Carlos Texera, has a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Geography from the Université de Québec à Montréal and earned his PhD in Geography from York University. He is currently a full professor in Geography at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in Kelowna, where he teaches introductory courses in human geography and upper-level courses in urban social geography, migration and settlement, the geography of housing, and population geography. I will now like to hand it over to Dr. Texera to share his presentation with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Carlos Texera, and the paper or the PowerPoint I will be presenting today focuses on the settlement and the housing experiences of recent immigrants in the interior of British Columbia, more precisely in the cities of Kelowna, where I live, and Kamloops. As you may know, most immigrants, when they arrive in Canada, they choose the MTV, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So the urban bias of Canadian immigration has led to policies intended to redirect immigration away from major metropolitan areas, particularly Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. At this stage, all levels of government have developed measures to attract and retain immigrants, thus rebalancing Canada's population. In Canada, we know relatively little about immigrants' settlement experiences, including their access to local services and their housing experiences and outcomes in small and mid-sized cities. We need more research focusing on the experience of immigrants in small and mid-sized cities, as well as rural areas of Canada. As you can see in Figure 1, the successful integration of immigrants in major urban areas, including small and mid-sized cities, are based on the attainment of several basic needs. You need to find a comfortable neighborhood. You need to have social networks to help your integration, ethnic business, etc. Also, access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, including education, access to jobs, and level and the source of income, as well as a welcoming society, a welcoming community to receive you. So this topic that I will be discussing today with you has policy implications for understanding new immigrants' settlement and housing experiences in small and mid-sized cities, as well as understanding how and why some immigrant groups are more successful than others in integrating into the social, cultural, and economic life of these communities. My paper today will will evaluate immigrant settlement experiences, including their access to local services and their housing experiences and outcomes in the city of Kelowna and Kamloops. I live in Kelowna. I'm familiar with Kelowna, which has one of the most expensive real estate markets. And the co-author of this paper, of this presentation, is Professor Julie Drolet from University of Alberta. She taught in a local university for a long time, so I joined forces with her. I had a great time with Julie doing this research. Also, this study assessed the state of community services and the role of the latter in attracting and retaining immigrants to both cities. We had 6 or 7 key questions that guided our study. And one of the key questions we had was, what is the socio-demographic profile of those recent immigrants living in Kelowna and Kamloops? What is the state of local services supporting immigrant communities? What role do services play in the successful integration of immigrants in these cities? Another question was, do available settlement community services and housing matter in their decisions to locate in Kelowna and Kamloops? What housing services exist to support immigrants' settlements in Kelowna and Kamloops? The other 3 questions focused on the major barriers and challenges that immigrants encountered when looking for housing in Kelowna and Kamloops. What is their current housing situation and what barriers, for example, ethnic background, race, language, income, source of income, have they faced in locating and obtaining affordable housing? Another question that we had was, what strategies are immigrants using to cope? Do the housing conditions of this group change or improve over time? And the last question was, what integrative role, if any, does a welcoming community play in the successful inclusion of new immigrants in Kelowna and Kamloops society? And finally, what policy changes are recommended to deal with the major issues, barriers, and challenges identified in this study. Data was collected in 2015. We did informal interviews with 19 key informants in Kelowna and Kamloops, and we had an in-depth questionnaire survey. It took approximately 45 minutes on average to fill out a long questionnaire survey dealing with the settlement and the housing experiences of immigrants. So we collected 80 questionnaires, surveys, 40 from Kelowna, 40 from Kamloops. All were immigrants, thus born outside Canada, and we focused on relatively recent immigrants. Only those who arrived in Canada between 2000 and 2014 were included in our study. Now I will show you several tables. I will not have time to go through all these details. So the first table that I have here deals with the renters' socio-demographic profile. I would like to emphasize that we only looked at renters. So we looked at immigrants born outside Canada, renters that arrived in Canada between 2000 and 2014. So we are dealing only with renters. You will see in 3 or 4 tables that I will show you 2 columns there and 40 and 40 to Kelowna and Kamloops and all the other variables here, which I will try my best to provide with some background, but I cannot go through all this information. I don't have the time. So with regard to the people that we interviewed, more than 2/3 were women. Most of these people that we interviewed, they were married and they have a good knowledge of the English language. They were fluent or they speak the language very well or well. In terms of education, again, approximately 2/3 in both Cologne and Kamloops, they arrived, at the time of the interviews, I should say, they had an university degree, so highly educated people. Also, in the past 12 months, they were working at a job or were self-employed. With regard to their current immigration status, most in Kamloops, 60% versus 45% in Kelowna, they were landed immigrants or citizens. When we look at the settlement in both cities, one key conclusion from our study is that they found some barriers, not only finding jobs and housing, but we will arrive there in a few seconds. First, I would like to let you know that of all those that we interviewed, we can say that the large majority arrived between 2006 to 2014. They are really recent immigrants. A significant number came directly to Kelowna and Kamloops, so they didn't go to any other city in Canada. They came directly to Kelowna, the first port of entry for these immigrants. And when we asked them the reasons for choosing Kelowna and Kamloops, quality of life and weather conditions was one of the reasons they choose both cities, or to join members of their families already established in both cities, economic opportunities, and or the city size, small, mid-sized cities, as well as the safety of these two cities in the interior of British Columbia. We also found that 53% in Kelowna and more than 2/3 or close to 2/3 in Kamloops, they knew somebody in Kelowna and or Kamloops, friends, relatives, and or the employers, even before they arrived in the city. So these people, they had some networks of contacts, which in turn played a very important role in helping these immigrants not only to find a place to live, but also to find a job. And this is not a surprise, because study after study in major cities show that networks of contact, social networks, always play a very important role in helping immigrants finding the first house to live as well as the first job. They also declared, 32% in Kelowna and 28% in Kamloops, that these networks of contacts, they were very helpful on arrival in Kelowna and Kamloops. For example, respondents from Kelowna, they said, I wish I could have connected to the community agencies, churches earlier, then I didn't need to experience too much difficulties. Using resources from the community could be very helpful, but it was not my case. So what we found is that often people rely so much in friends and relatives, and they don't even know that there are local communities, local organizations that could help them in the initial stages of settlement. In terms of housing expectations, often we heard from people, oh, it was like a cultural shock when we arrived in Kelowna and Kamloops with respect to find housing and jobs. It was not easy. It was not easy for these people to find housing and jobs, and you will see why. We asked them, what were your housing expectations before coming to Canada? And we obtained some interesting results. 83% in Kelowna and 58% in Kamloops, they thought it would be relatively easy to find affordable housing in Canada at cheaper prices, which was not the case. Also, 33% in Kelowna and 45% in Kamloops seem to have expected Canada would have better quality housing. Others declared they were expecting a much easier experience, a more positive experience initially when they arrived in their local communities here. And also an interesting number here, or percentage, were expecting better programs and more support from the government. These were the expectations they had before they arrived in Canada. Now let's move to the housing experiences by looking at table 2A, which focuses on the current housing situation. So the type of houses they were living at the time of the interviews. In terms of tenure, they were all renters, as you can see, 63% in Kelowna and 55% in Kamloops. They were renting an entire unit. We had also less than 1/4 or approximately 1/4 or less renting a room only. We had other people renting basements and so on. In terms of subsidized housing, the large majority, as you can see in this table, they were living in non-subsidized housing. With regard to the current type of housing, interesting, only 25% of these immigrants were renting a single detached house. Not easy to find them in Kelowna, plus they are very expensive. In contrast to 43% in Kamloops that declared living in a single detached house. In fact, most immigrants in Kelowna, they were living in apartments with less than 4 stories. In terms of length of occupancy, they were living in those dwellings for between 1 and 3 years. In terms of current monthly rent, we find that 30% in Kelowna and Kamloops were paying between $1,000 and $1,500. With regard to the percent of monthly income spent on housing, we find that in both cities, people are spending more than 30% of their income in housing, so they are in core housing need. In fact, the column here between 30 and 50%, we find that I have difficulties from here, but I can see now 37% in Kelowna and 40% in Kamloops, they were paying between 30 and 50% of their income. So these immigrants, they were paying a lot of money in rents. On social housing list, only a small percentage there. And with regard to plans of owning a dwelling, you know, the large majority, again, study after study in this country shows that the ultimate goal for immigrants in this country is to own a place that they can call home, you know. And no surprise here again with 73% and 83% in Kelowna and Kamloops of immigrants saying, my ultimate dream is one day to own a home, to own a dwelling, a place that I can call my own space. When we ask them for the reasons for moving from the last resident to the present resident, the residents they were living at the time of the interviews, we found that the most important reasons, the most important push-pull forces were due to housing location, accessibility to be close to public transportation, to work or schools. It's very important for immigrants, some with large families, some don't own a car, so accessibility is a very important reason for moving. Another very important reason was unaffordable housing, rents too expensive. They complained, rents too expensive, we had to move in search of more affordable rents. And another question was bad or not acceptable quality of their neighborhoods. Some respondents mentioned unsafe neighborhoods, unfriendly neighborhoods, noisy areas, lacking also green spaces, including parks. So from location to unaffordable housing to bad or not acceptable quality of neighborhoods. Looking for housing is always a very stressful experience, and particularly to immigrants. In fact, 60% in Kelowna and 40% in Kamloops declared it a very difficult experience. And when we asked them why the housing search was so stressful, most indicated rents too expensive. So their income versus housing costs play an important role there. The size, the number of kids, of children in a family, and the number of rooms also played a very important role. You know that it's not easy for a large family to find affordable rental housing today. Another reason was housing location, accessibility, and neighborhood quality. and as well as lack of in-depth and reliable housing information about local housing markets. Immigrants, particularly the most recent ones, they need more information about rent prices, types of housing available in the market, renters' rights, location, as well as accessibility. How many families don't know if the house is close to schools or close to public transportation and so on? So a lot of work need to be done here to help our immigrants. I will skip these quotations coming from our paper. You can download this PowerPoint. Also, this paper was published in the Journal of Housing and the Built Environment, so you can always contact me or AMSSA and you can have access to this paper. So I will quote these quotations. When we asked these people, when they looked for housing, which sources of information they used, the answers are clear. Most immigrants used websites or the social media. They relied also extensively on information coming from relatives and friends, local newspapers, and also just walking or around the city looking for rental signs. Another table, this one dealing with the current housing conditions and residential satisfaction. We find that in terms of number of persons per dwelling, we had 2 to 3 people per dwelling. In terms of dwelling crowding, we find that we didn't see too many people declaring overcrowding as a major problem. In fact, the majority said mentioned comfortable, I have enough rooms in my dwelling. With regard to dwelling conditions, most were in good state of repair. With regard to the level of satisfaction with their dwelling, also, we find that the large majority, more than 2/3 or more, they were very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with their dwelling. And with regard, the same applies to the neighborhood. Despite the fact that some commented on issues of unsafe neighborhoods, etc., etc., but when we asked this question, the large majority, 2/3 or more, declared very satisfied with their dwelling and housing. The last few slides will focus on recommendations. We asked these people, after identifying the barriers, the challenges they faced with regard to their settlement and housing experiences, we asked them, what do we need to do? What do you recommend? They are the insiders, so they know what they're talking about. And the next slides you will see will be presented around these main topics. Recommendations on how to improve housing opportunities for immigrants. Another set of recommendations deal with the housing types immigrants want and need, or options that should be more available, and tenants' relationships with the landlords. Another set of recommendations deals with the availability and quality of housing information for immigrants. And last but not least, on recommendations on how to improve local neighborhoods and with which areas, which areas that immigrants should avoid in their housing search. Let's start with the recommendations dealing with housing types or options that should be more available and tenants' relationships with landlords. I will not mention the percentages because you can download this PowerPoint. I will just go to the main points. Immigrants suggested more apartments, more condos should be available, followed by townhouses. These are types of accommodations that immigrants want. Since 1/3 of the respondents in both cities complained about the lack of affordable housing to accommodate large families with children, and some respondents believed that they were denied rental housing because they had children or animals. So one of the possible, what is the solution to deal with this problem? Is probably education of private sector landlords and the building of more more affordable public housing. So we need to do something here, because if you have a large family, you pay a huge price in today's housing markets, whether it is in small, mid-sized cities or major metropolitan areas. Another group indicated that landlords should have less power because of the perceived issues of discrimination that these people found. So it's not only the issue of race, the color of your skin, of ethnicity, religion, but the number of children also plays an important role when you look for housing and the barriers that you encounter. Another group indicated that landlords should provide more information, be more clear when renting about housing rental rules, including tenant landlords' rights. Recommendations again continue here. We have a high percentage of respondents in both cities that indicated that immigrants also should do more in-depth housing and neighborhood searches before selecting their residences. Quite often we find immigrants, after 1 week searching, after looking at 3 or 4 houses, they finish by renting. And then they don't realize that it's too far from schools, too far from public transportation, etc., etc. So they recommend other immigrants to do a more in-depth search here. Also, the need for renters to become also better informed about BC housing rental laws, as well as tenant landlords' rights. So they have also they have a work to do here and know more about their rights as tenants, as well as about the landlord's rights. Other recommendations here, I think, in terms of local community organizations, they should play a more active role by providing detailed information on housing and neighborhood options, and by helping immigrants more directly in their search for affordable rental housing, including access to government subsidized housing or social housing. Also, they recommended more subsidized and affordable housing is needed, particularly to accommodate the housing needs of large families. Also, local government and community organizations could offer workshops and information sessions for tenants and landlords. And we have already organizations doing a fabulous job, but we need more and more organizations doing that to inform, to educate our immigrants about the local housing markets. So some members of this study declared issues of discrimination by the landlords, but effective anti-discrimination policies need to be implemented, as previous studies in Canada have shown that race and ethnicity remain major barriers to equal treatment in Canada's housing market. So we have some more work to do here. Also, there is a need for mainstream organizations to offer specialized housing services that provide information and assistance to new immigrants about their local real estate markets. So I'm repeating myself here one more time, but local organizations, they can and they should help our immigrants in their housing search process. Despite the efforts of different levels of government and local community organizations to support new immigrant settlement and integration in both Kelowna and Kamloops, much work remains to be done to accommodate newcomers' culturally diverse and complex needs, including access, again, to housing information and housing programs. To conclude, immigrants highly recommended that more information sources be available before they leave their own countries, or just after their arrival in Canada, specializing in settlement and housing services that are appropriate to new immigrants' housing needs and preferences. Another key recommendation is making such specialized, culturally oriented information available before new immigrants' departure and or on arrival in Canada could play a determining role in helping settlement experiences, including access to local services, as well as finding a place to live and or a job. It is evident that both in Cologne and Kamloops can benefit from immigration. And this is my last slide. No doubts about it. We are in the interior of British Columbia. We have problems attracting immigrants because immigrants, to attract them to come to the interior of BC, we need to provide them with jobs, but also affordable, suitable, and adequate housing. And we need immigrants because they play a very important role in the social, cultural, and economic life of our communities. However, for policies to succeed in attracting and retaining immigrants to these cities in the interior of British Columbia depends on the presence of more subsidized and affordable housing. Also, job opportunities that match immigrants' qualifications and that offer an adequate income. And more we find in our studies highly qualified immigrants arriving here, and we don't recognize their diplomas, etc., etc., etc. You know that story. And the last point is quality services and programs to integrate new immigrants into the community. So these are the recommendations coming from 80 recent immigrants that we interviewed in Kelowna and Kamloops. Thank you.
I'd like to now invite our next speaker, Elizabeth Lafrancois. Elizabeth is part of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation team that delivers Canada's national housing strategy. She works with a variety of groups in the province to support the delivery of affordable housing. Prior to this position, Elizabeth was in public affairs, both for CMHC and the Quebec government. Please help me welcome Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here this morning. My name is Elizabeth Lefrancois, and I am an affordable housing consultant with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, so better known as CMHC. I had a lot of fun putting this presentation together. I work in the affordable housing sector, and I was mandated to give you an overview of the corporation, and I did learn a lot of great things, so thank you. And before we get started, I would like to show you a short video that gives a little bit more information about what is CMHC and what we do.
More than an address or a structure, a home is the building block of family and society that gathers us and holds us together, no matter where we're from. We open the door and feel secure in our place in the community, in our country. Your own apartment, your own home, your own place to make memories, take comfort, and build a better future. It is a powerful ideal that is linked by the strongest of bonds to our identity as a nation. That's why for more than 70 years, no single organization has been more fundamental to building an inclusive housing system than Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. From the biggest cities to the smallest towns of this vast country, housing matters to all Canadians. Helping Canadians meet their housing needs is what we do. Our nationally available mortgage loan insurance facilitates access to rental housing and allows qualified Canadians to become homeowners. Just as important is ensuring our lenders have reliable access to funds, providing more choices for Canadians to find a mortgage, no matter where they live. That's good for the home buyer, for our housing system, and for the financial stability of our country. When it comes to opening doors for Canadians, our people are at the forefront, offering support, guidance, and expertise in the field, and creating comprehensive tools and resources for housing sector professionals. The research we do and the data we collect and analyze allows us to provide unrivaled insight to an evolving marketplace. It helps mortgage professionals become more informed about what their clients want and expect. It allows developers to supply properties that meet those demands. And it informs decisions by all levels of government on policy and investment in Canada's housing market. We know adequate housing creates the conditions for success. Working with our partners, we help support affordable housing for all Canadians, including seniors, Indigenous, low-income households, and other vulnerable people in Canada. Our quality of life is considered one of the best in the world. It's no accident that Canada's housing system is held up as an example of what we can all accomplish when we use innovation and passion to keep moving forward. Home is at the heart of our country. For many Canadians, it starts with us.
So, as you can see, CMHC is involved in most areas of housing in Canada. However, I just want to clarify before going further that we do not provide direct customer service to the public. Our customers are service providers such as lenders, municipality, provincial government, First Nations government, groups developing affordable housing. So we provide support to those organizations in order for them to deliver better service to the public. How CMHC works is that we're a crown corporation, which means that it's owned by the government, but it operates at arm's length. We report to Canada's Parliament through a minister, the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Minister Jean-Yves Duclos. We're governed by a board of directors and regularly report to them on our activities, and the Government of Canada is our one and only shareholder. And any money that we raise or collect beyond that, we give back to the government. And as the video mentioned, our mission is to help Canadians meet their housing needs. These are our business activities. The various sectors at CMHC all work to support the housing system, and the activities they do are all quite different, and they serve a diverse group of clients. I will focus today on three main groups, the ones that I think are most relevant to you and your organizations, which are mortgage loan insurance, policy and research, and affordable housing. However, if you wish to learn more about First Nation housing programs that we offer or securitization, I would be happy to connect with you after the conference and also send you information or point you to the right contact person. So, mortgage loan insurance, what is that? It's a sector that develops policy related to mortgage loan insurance, and it focuses on the operational, tactical business of underwriting and assessing the risk of individual mortgages before we insure them. So, when you buy a home, mortgage loan insurance is mandatory in Canada when the buyer of a home has less than 20% down payment. And CMHC provides that insurance services to your lender. So with that service, Canadians can buy a home with a minimum of 5% down payment and at interest rates comparable to those with larger down payments. So this sector has two main clients, the banks and the home buyers that are applying for mortgages. They do offer a variety of tools, and they are on our website. They're called Housing Financial Literacy, and there are calculator and apps that help you create your current and future budget for housing. There is a full site for newcomers. The link is there, cmhc.ca/newcomers. And it includes information on renting an apartment in Canada, buying a home in Canada, planning and managing your mortgage. There's also a home buying step-by-step guide. So it's all on our website at cmhc.ca, and I think you might find some of the tools quite useful for your clients. Our next group is policy and research. As Canada's authority on housing, information is a big part of what we do, and our policy and research sector provides policy and advice to the federal government. It studies real estate market, housing construction, and much more. And their main clients are the government, decision makers, and industry professionals. Why would it be useful for you? Is that they do also provide a variety of information and tools. One of the key ones being the Housing Market Information Portal. That portal is whether you're looking for up-to-date, high-level national and provincial housing statistic, or you want to drill down to your local data for your specific city, it gives you access to a comprehensive market data. So let's say you are in Victoria and you're looking for information, you can go on the portal and you can scroll down to not only Victoria but neighborhoods, and then it would provide you with statistic on average rents for studios, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedrooms, what's the average rents, what are the vacancy rates. There is a lot of information and it is updated yearly, so it's a great tool if you're new to an area and are looking for statistics. That group, the policy and research group, would also be the one that could provide you information on the national occupancy standard. And I know this has been a concern for some of your clients or even for you. Just as an FYI, the national occupancy standard, the NOS, is a guideline used for housing suitability in Canada. It remains the sole discretion of provincial and municipal housing authorities to use the national occupancy standard to inform their guidelines for matching families to social housing units. The CMHC does not dictate how the housing authorities should use those thresholds. They're solely guidelines. And the application of the NOS is solely at the discretion of the organization applying it. So if a co-op, it is up to the board of directors to decide whether they're applying the NOS guidelines or not. So just an FYI. The policy and research group also provides you with a lot of research and information, and it is all on our website. There's one that was published in 2016. It's called the Newcomers First-Time Home Buying Experience, and that was the first year CMHC conducted that research, and it aims to provide insight and to mortgage professional on the behaviors, attitude, and expectations of newcomers, first-time home buyer. That group also works closely with Statistic Canada on gathering some data, such as core housing need, which is defined as a household that does not meet one or more of the adequacy, suitability, or affordability standard and has to spend 30% or more on its before tax income to access local housing. So Statistic Canada did publish just recently some data on core housing need. They have interactive tables per region, so it's worth checking it out. In BC, the actual rate of core housing need for the whole province is 14.9%. So that was policy and research. Now moving on to affordable housing, which is the sector I work in. We work with, so we have a variety of funding programs to support the creation of affordable housing, and we'll work with nonprofit organizations, municipalities, developers, church group, basically anyone that owns a piece of land and that's looking to develop affordable housing. We will work with them and guide them through the process and try to find them access to funding through our programs or through the province program. We also have a partnership with BC Housing where the federal government would flow fund through the province for housing, and they also manage a variety of programs. One of the good example that has received support from both BC and the federal government is the Welcome Center with ISS of BC in Vancouver. Some of you on the online might be part of that organization, so you could probably speak better about that project than I can, but it is a great project. It is a refugees and immigrants hub, a one-stop housing and support center. It addresses the immediate needs of refugees with or without legal status and immigrants in Metro Vancouver. And it provides 18 units, so up to 138 beds of housing units, a primary healthcare clinic, newcomer youth drop-in, a child minding space, etc. It is a great project, and it has received support from the federal government. So if you are an organization that is looking into developing housing and you own a piece of land or is looking into it, I would be happy to connect with you and go over those programs in details. Also, still in the affordable housing sector, we have a lot more coming in the next 10 years as CMHC is leading the National Housing Strategy, a 10-year, $40 billion plan that will give more Canadians a place to call home. The strategy is a national initiative built through extensive consultations over a period of close to 2 years with Canadians from all walks of life. It reestablished a federal leadership role in housing. Some of the key targets for the National Housing Strategy, overall it aims to lift 530,000 families and individuals out of housing needs. The new Canada Housing Benefits that will help with rent affordability is a key tool in achieving that goal. It also aims to reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. And it will preserve affordability and improve housing conditions for 385,000 families and individuals. And it will build new affordable rentals and community housing with a plan to support construction of 100,000 new units. So, it's quite... we have really high expectations of the strategy, and there is a lot more coming. Some of the programs will be implemented on April 1st. Some, such as the Canada Housing Benefit, will come later. I think it is 2020 or 2021. But over the next 10 years, the federal government, with the help of the provincial governments, will be supporting creation of a lot of new rental and preserving rental units that are affordable. So this is what I had for you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and feel free to connect with me at any time, and we're also here for questions after. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. If you have questions for either Elizabeth or Carlos, please do send them in. We will get to the Q&A session right after our last presenter, Andrew Sakamoto. So Andrew is a graduate of Simon Fraser University with a communications degree, and he has been the executive director of the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center since 2013. As a member of the BC Rental Housing Coalition, City of Vancouver Renters Advisory Committee, and the Residential Tenancy Branch Operational Stakeholders Committee, Andrew is passionate about strengthening the legal protections of tenants across British Columbia through improved education and legislative amendments. I would now like to hand it over to Andrew to share his presentation with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew. And I'd just like to thank AMSSA, first off, for inviting me to speak today. And we were talking earlier about the turnout today, and it really is quite impressive. So for all of you out there, thank you so much for logging in today to listen to us and to engage with us online. So I've been asked here today to provide a very brief overview of what my organization, TRAC, can do for newcomers, and also provide, again, a very brief overview of the Residential Tenancy Act, which is the law that governs tenants and landlords in BC. Before getting into the law, for anyone who isn't aware with TRAC, I just wanted to go over our mandate and some of the services we provide. So TRAC was founded in 1984. We're a small nonprofit organization that promotes the legal protection of residential tenants all across BC by providing information, education, support, and research on residential tenancy matters. Put simply, we provide free legal information and education to renters in British Columbia. So here's a rundown of the services we can provide all tenants, including newcomers. Most importantly, we provide direct advocacy. So we have one full-time in-house practicing lawyer who runs this program for our organization and provides direct representation for tenants at the Residential Tenancy Branch's Dispute Resolution Service. So this is essentially BC's tenant-landlord court. If you find yourself in a legal problem with a landlord, you don't have to hire an expensive lawyer and go to small claims court or provincial court. It's all done through an administrative tribunal called the Residential Tenancy Branch. And again, the service is called Dispute Resolution. So you'll probably hear me refer to that a few times throughout my presentation. And so through our direct advocacy program, we actually take on clients and represent them at those hearings. Moving on down the list there, we have our tenant info line, which is a Monday to Friday phone service that's available to the public. We have 1 or 2 staff available for a 4-hour shift each day to answer any type of question you have about residential tenancy law, your rights and responsibilities as a tenant. Obviously, we provide legal education workshops and webinars such as this one. My presentation today is going to be quite short. If any of you out there are interested in arranging for TRAC to provide a longer, probably 2-hour presentation for newcomers or settlement workers on the fundamentals of residential tenancy law, that definitely is something that TRAC can provide. So yeah, please do reach out to us if you're interested in that. We'll get to our contact info in a few slides here. We provide multilingual and plain language publications. Our most popular legal publication is called the Tenant Survival Guide, and we're just in the process of rewriting that. Hopefully a lot of you out there have heard of that before. It's been around since 1984, just like our organization. And again, we're just hoping to reprint about 10,000 copies sometime over the next few months, and those can be available for free through Crown Publications. We also offer a multilingual pamphlet that provides the very basics of residential tenancy law that's been translated in up to 18 different languages. Moving on, we provide a very comprehensive website and also an online course called Renting It Right. So I've put a screenshot of the course up there. It's a free video-based and self-paced course that has been broken up into 2 parts. So part 1 deals with finding rental housing and safely signing a tenancy agreement. And part 2 deals with your rights and responsibilities during your tenancy and how to establish a good relationship with your landlord. So students work their way through a number of videos and exercises and ultimately reach a final exam. And upon passing the exam, you're provided a certificate of completion that has been endorsed by Landlord BC. So Landlord BC is the leading landlord organization in the province. And we wanted this course, we wanted them to be on board with this course. We wanted their members, their landlords, to view the course certificate positively. So they've reviewed all of our content and endorsed the course. Okay, so there's our contact information, our website, our online course, and the phone numbers we can be reached at. The top one there, 255-3099, that's our direct administrative line. And so if you call that number, you can get to our various staff's extensions. We definitely, we don't make that available to, we don't advertise that broadly to the public, but certainly for advocates and settlement workers and service providers, we like them to have that direct contact number so that you can reach out to us when you're in urgent need of information. In addition to TRAC, the other really important resource for tenants and landlords to know about in BC is the Residential Tenancy Branch. So this is the provincial government department in charge of this area of law. Like TRAC, they offer a phone service, a website, and online tools. Most importantly, again, they provide dispute resolution, which is the tenant-landlord court in BC. There's actually only one physical location in BC. It's in Burnaby. However, Service BC centers act as extensions of the Residential Tenancy Branch all across the province. So if you're not close to Burnaby and you want to, for instance, file an application for dispute resolution, you can do so at Service BC centers as well. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the law. And again, these presentations that we provide are usually an hour and a half, 2 hours long. So I'm really going to have to condense this and touch on only the most fundamental points. So, first off, very relevant for newcomers, tenancy laws in BC are different than tenancy laws in other parts of the world. So BC has its own provincial legislation that's unique to BC. Very important point, the Residential Tenancy Act cannot be avoided. So what this means is that a landlord can't force a tenant to contract out of the law or sign an agreement that reduces their rights. So for example, a landlord can't include a term in an agreement saying they're allowed to enter a tenant's home whenever they want. The Residential Tenancy Act clearly states that a landlord has to provide 24 hours written notice if they want to enter a rental unit. And that's regardless of what's written into a tenancy agreement. If a landlord tries to avoid that area of the law, that term will be unenforceable and illegal. And the final point there, landlords also can't include unconscionable terms. And so basically what that means is they can't include anything that's oppressive or grossly unfair. Okay, another one of the first things we like to cover in these presentations is figuring out whether or not your client is actually covered under the Residential Tenancy Act. You want to be covered under this law. This is the law that the residential tenancy branch and track can help you with. So you want to be covered under this law. Unfortunately, not everyone is covered, and there's some key exclusions. So first off, if you share kitchen or bathroom facilities with the owner of a property, you're actually not covered under the Residential Tenancy Act. So for newcomers, this could be an international student coming over and participating in a homestay program. Again, if you're sharing kitchen and bathroom with the owner, you're not covered. Very similarly, if you rent from another tenant and not the actual landlord, you're also not covered under the Residential Tenancy Act. So this is common in shared houses where a tenant will move in and deal solely with a roommate that they're living with, and the roommate won't even inform the landlord. You want to establish a tenancy with the actual landlord, not simply another tenant that you live with. And moving on down the list, this list isn't exhaustive. There's more examples than are on this slide, but those are some of the other most common ones. So co-op housing, student housing, emergency shelter or transitional housing, and vacation or travel accommodation are other examples of housing that are not protected under the Residential Tenancy Act. Okay, just wanted to cover some other key points here. So it's very common for tenants and landlords to simply shake hands and establish a tenancy. That way, people don't always put paper to pen or have a written contract. That's okay, but it's not recommended. So verbal tenancies are covered under the Residential Tenancy Act, but we definitely recommend having a written agreement with your landlord. Illegal secondary suites are also covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, but again, you want to be careful with them. If your city finds out about an illegal suite, they could come and order your landlord to shut it down, in which case you would have to move without your landlord providing any moving costs. But the key takeaway is that illegal secondary suites are protected by the provincial legislation, the Residential Tenancy Act. All evictions can be challenged. So there are three main types of eviction notices. I'm not going to get into them in this presentation, but keep in mind that each one of them can be challenged or disputed at dispute resolution. So you can have a 10-day notice for non-payment of rent. The deadline to dispute that is 5 days, so it's very short. You can have a 1-month notice for cause. The deadline to dispute that is 10 days. And the third type of eviction notice is a 2-month notice for landlord's use of property. And the deadline to dispute that is only 15 days. So you have some very short and strict deadlines. So if you do have clients coming to you with evictions that aren't warranted, or they want a chance to fight that eviction, it's very important to get your applications in quickly in order to make sure you meet those deadlines. As a tenant, you also have the right to timely return of your deposits. So this is one of the most common questions we get, and it's actually an area of the law that is quite beneficial for tenants. So basically, when you're moving out of a rental unit, the first step for you to do is to provide your forwarding address in writing to your landlord for where you want your deposit sent. Once you've done that and your tenancy is ended, your landlord has 15 days to either return your deposit, get your permission to keep the deposit, or apply to the residential tenancy branch for permission to keep your deposit. So notice they don't have the right to just decide on their own to keep your deposit. They have to have your permission or the residential tenancy branch's permission. And again, the deadline is 15 days for them to do one of those things. If they don't do one of those things within 15 days, you actually have the right to go after your landlord for double the amount of the deposit. So it's actually a quite good area of the law for tenants, and one of the most common questions we get at TRAC. Limited rent increases. So another common topic. Each year, the government will release what the allowable rent increase percentage is. So it fluctuates year to year. Last year, it was 3.7%. This year, in 2018, it's 4%. So that's the maximum a landlord can legally raise your rent. Now, in order to do that, they have to give you 3 months' notice on an approved government form. So the residential tenancy branch has standard forms for tenants and landlords to use. They have to be using that form or a custom form that has all the same information on it. 3 months notice, and the maximum for this year is 4%. Quiet enjoyment is the next point on the list there. This is a very important principle in residential tenancy law that gives tenants the right to be free from unreasonable disturbances such as noise, smoke, and intimidation and harassment. Also freedom from illegal landlord entry. So I was saying earlier, a landlord has to provide you with 24 hours written notice if they want to enter your home. And finally there, as a tenant, you have the right to have housing that's suitable for occupation. So the Residential Tenancy Act says that landlords have to maintain health, housing, and safety standards required by law. Complementing the Residential Tenancy Act are various standards of maintenance or similar bylaws that municipalities pass. So definitely a good idea to check in your community or municipality if yours has a standards of maintenance or similar type of bylaw. Now, I did want to touch on one key Residential Tenancy Act amendment that has recently been passed. So with the new provincial government coming into power, they've been quite eager to strengthen renters' protections, which is great. And one of the ways they've done that is by making some changes to the law. So for years, TRAC's number one priority for legislative change was eliminating what we call vacate clauses. So what was happening was landlords were using fixed-term tenancies with vacate clauses to circumvent rent control. So what would happen is a landlord would sign a tenant to, say, a 1-year lease or fixed-term tenancy with a clause requiring them to move out at the end of the term. So then the 1 year would pass by, and they would go to the tenant and say, if you want to stay, your lease is officially and legally ending on this date. If you want to stay, you have to sign a brand new agreement with brand new terms, including rent at whatever I want it to be. So we would see tenants have to sign agreements in order to stay for 20, 30% rent increases. Alternatively, the landlord could simply arbitrarily decide to kick out the tenant and bring someone new in. So it really eroded any sort of sense of security of tenure for the tenant. So this was a major issue for TRAC, something we spoke to the residential tenancy branch about. We were quite vocal in the media about it, and something we brought up with the new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs. And thankfully, they have eliminated vacate clauses, except in 2 limited circumstances. So the first is a very simple one. It's a sublet where, if you're a tenant and you want to, say, go on a 3-month vacation somewhere and then come back and reclaim your housing, you can use this type of vacate clause where you require your subtenant to vacate when you come back. The other time you can use it is if you're a landlord and you want to, again, move out of your housing temporarily and then move back in and actually live there. So what this is going to do is get rid of the most egregious abuses of this practice. So landlords will no longer be able to cycle new tenants in each year or each 6 months and keep raising the rent. Pretty much the only time they can use this vacate clause is if they intend to actually move back into their property and live there. So it's a huge improvement, and most importantly, it's been made retrospectively, which means it applies to all existing tenancies. So if you have clients out there, their tenancy agreement might say one thing. It might say that they have a vacate clause, but the reality is that since this law has been passed retrospectively, any existing vacate clauses are now void and unenforceable. Okay, and the final slide I have here, I'm just going to briefly touch on discrimination because I can imagine that would be a huge issue for a lot of you out there. So, according to Section 10 of the BC Human Rights Code, which addresses discrimination in tenancies, a landlord cannot discriminate against a tenant due to their race, color, ancestry, place of origin, religion, marital status, family status, physical or mental disability, sex, sexual orientation, age, or lawful source of income. So, and this was mentioned earlier, a landlord, for instance, can set restrictions on the total number of people who live in a rental unit, but they can't reject you simply because you have children. Admittedly, TRAC deals with the Residential Tenancy Act, and this, while discrimination certainly intersects with residential tenancy law, we usually refer cases to the BC Human Rights Clinic. So that's the key referral here. It's the BC Human Rights Clinic run through the Community Legal Assistance Society, and their contact information is there. And that's everything. There you go.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Great,
Really
thank you.
appreciate that. Thanks. So we will now move to the question and answer period. I would like to move to our panelists to ask some of the questions that we have received from our service provider organizations. And the first I think that I'd like to ask is there anything different in terms of the housing strategy or the research or some of the laws, anything different for government-assisted refugees or privately sponsored refugees? So if anybody would like to answer that.
From a legal standpoint, because that's what that's sort of our area of expertise, the Residential Tenancy Act does have a few exceptions for nonprofit housing. So particularly when it comes to rent increases. If you fit this definition in the residential tenancy regulation and your rent is related to your income, then you can be exempt from the rent increase provisions in the Residential Tenancy Act.
Okay, great, thank you. Elizabeth or Carlos, anything that you wanted to add? No? Okay, so the next question is, Andrew, for TRAC, do they have guides in different languages, for example, Arabic? And if you can let us know what different languages are available?
Yeah, so we have two main publications. One is our Tenant Survival Guide, which is quite a comprehensive guide. Unfortunately, we only have that in English just because of the we're quite a small organization and just the expenses that come along with translating and reprinting the guide. So we do have our Tenant Survival Guide only in English. but we have our tenant info pamphlet translated into 18 different languages, including Arabic.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And Elizabeth?
And just to add that our Newcomers website is also offered in many languages. I can't tell you which one, but I know there's quite a few on the website. So if you go, you can choose
Great.
different languages.
Okay, and I think we have the website
Yes.
listed as a resource, so
Yeah.
people can go there. Thank you. Another question for Andrew. Some landlords only want their tenants to pay their rent in cash and not via check or e-transfer, as perhaps the landlord may not be declaring the income for tax purposes. Would this have an implication for the tenant with Revenue Canada or with the tenancy branch? And do you have any advice on what the tenant should do?
So a landlord is generally allowed to request that rent be paid in cash, but the Residential Tenancy Act is quite clear that the landlord has to provide a receipt
Okay.
when rent is paid in cash.
Okay, so then the tenant should ask for a receipt for this purpose. Okay,
Yes,
great.
definitely.
Thank you. Okay, I think a question for all of you is settlement organizations are sometimes limited in their funding, as you know. What kind of simple and affordable best practices might support collaboration across newcomer service provider organizations and housing and rental organizations? Elizabeth, would you like to take that?
Can you just repeat it?
Sure.
So,
As settlement organizations are sometimes limited in their funding, what kind of simple and affordable best practices might support collaboration across newcomer service providing organizations and housing and rental organizations?
I would definitely start with having a conversation with your municipalities. They often have affordable housing funds, so they could maybe have a little fund that provides supports for newcomers looking for rental. BC Housing as well provide a variety of support to the public. So that's really, I think, your two main key contacts to start discussion and kind of create a partnership. And
Yeah, I can. So one of the most useful resources or organizations that TRAC works with is called PovNet. They're
oh yeah.
they're like a 1.5 person small but mighty team, and they work to help facilitate discussions and connect advocates and service providers across BC using online tools. So for instance, there's a housing email list where I think upwards of 300, 400 advocates from all parts of BC can ask questions and share resources and just sort of have conversations about housing online. And I know they're always looking at new innovative ways of developing other opportunities for advocates and service providers and settlement workers to collaborate. So it's PovNet, and you can reach out to them and try to be added to those lists. There's a housing list, there's a family law list, there's a welfare list. So yeah, that's one idea that comes to mind.
Great, thank you. So for Carlos, we have heard about the Atlantic immigration pilot, but what have you been hearing about the government measures or the province's policies to attract newcomers to the more rural areas of BC? And if maybe you can speak to that.
Yes, the government, as all levels of government, they have tried their best to attract more and more immigrants, not only to rural areas. We have the case of the Atlantic provinces. The Globe and Mail published a great article 2 weeks ago or so about Prince Edward Island as a good laboratory. If I use the example of the Atlantic provinces, it's true the policies are there, the instruments are there, they attract immigrants, but after 2-3 years they don't have they are not capable to retain those immigrants there, because immigrants, they gravitate, they go where most friends, relatives, where established communities exists already. The example of Kelowna, for example, we are in the tier of BC, Kelowna, Penticton, Vernon, even going further north. We have problems attracting immigrants for different reasons. One is jobs that pay. And the second, and in the case of of Kelowna, we have one of the most expensive real estate markets in Canada, the fourth or the fifth most expensive. Plus, we lose because we are so close to Vancouver. Whether you are Asian or not, you will go where you have ethnic established communities. I understand the effort that has been made by different levels of government, particularly the Atlantic provinces. They need. We are aging. Our population is aging and aging fast. We have low, when we look at the total fertility level, the rate should be 2.1. And we are below these levels. And immigrants, I mentioned before, we play an important role. We have an impact not only in the social and cultural and economic life of this country, but when we talk about demographics, we also play a very important role. And it's in the interest of rural communities, of small and mid-sized communities to attract immigrants, because those communities are aging. Yeah. And we need also more research about the rural communities. So I applaud the efforts that have been made. In the case of the Maritimes, for example, is how to retain these people. And also, we need follow-ups on these studies is to see, to look at and see 5-10 years from now if these 80 people, they're still living in Kelowna and Kamloops, to follow them throughout time. But anyway, this is a good question, and we need to work more closely on that. It's true that the statistics, they have shown that the number of people moving to the MTV, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver reduced a little bit, you know, and those smaller communities have gained population. This is a good sign. My question is, and I leave the question on the air, in the long term, what will happen?
Thank you. Elizabeth or Andrew, would you like to add anything to that? Okay.
Couldn't have said it better.
Okay, well, a question for you, Andrew. Regarding the 2-hour presentation that TRAC offers, do organizations have to pay for this? And if so, what is the cost? And also, is there a minimum number of attendees required?
Yeah. Generally, we usually waive the fee. We sometimes, if an organization is able to to contribute a little bit of money, they may throw an honorarium our way, or if it's a larger organization, sometimes we'll present for the University of Victoria, or a municipality will reach out to us. We'll sometimes have a $200 fee, but no, for anyone who's watching right now and wants to reach out to us, we can certainly waive the fee for you. And in terms of a minimum audience, we don't have a strict minimum, but we'd like to say at least 10 to 12 people would be the minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good sized group. And another question, actually, does a landlord have the right to ask what a potential tenant's legal immigration status is in Canada? That was a really good question.
Really good question.
Yes, if any of you would like to answer that.
I'd probably have to look that up. I know the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner has a great resource document that has some guidelines for tenants and landlords.
Right.
So there might be something in there, but I wouldn't know on the spot here.
It's good we are talking about landlords and renters, and study after study I found that there is this lack of dialogue. The renters, they don't know too much about their rights as tenants, as well as about the landlords. So we need to increase this dialogue, and it's good to know that we have mechanisms there to help our immigrants to deal with this issue. We arrive here, we don't speak the language, we don't know how the city, we don't know how the housing markets work. Some never lived in a condo, a townhouse. They come from, so there are so many barriers and challenges, and we need to increase this dialogue between landlords and tenants.
Elizabeth and I were talking earlier about the importance of proactive education. So many of the tenants we speak to have already found themselves in a legal problem and now are contacting us to fix it. And especially through resources like our online course, it's been designed for all tenants, but it's particularly tailored to first-time renters. And there was a real goal to sort of make it a lot of sort of proactive education in terms of what do you need to know during your rental housing search and when you're, before you're even signing a tenancy agreement.
And the most common comment or answer we get from immigrants in terms of barriers is large families with 2, 3, 4 kids. They face huge barriers. It takes them longer to find a house. They found the housing search more stressful. We need children in this country. As I mentioned, our country is aging. We want to attract more immigrants, and then they face this barrier of children. So what to do?
Yeah. Speaking of barriers, there's also the language barrier, of course. What are your thoughts on how we can reduce judgments made of newcomers based on their accent and non-Anglophone family names? Should newcomers be themselves or try to find ways to work around these language barriers? If you can maybe say your thoughts.
I am the best example. I was born in the middle of the Atlantic. I learned French first. Now I am a professor at UBC, and I see the difference in terms of treatment. Let's forget housing for the moment. My accent is still there, less and less, but it's still there. People ask me immediately, where were you born? And no, be yourself. Why should you try to circumvent? No, be yourself. We are a multicultural country. This is a country of immigrants with people from different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, religions. That's what makes this country so unique. Exactly. So you don't have to hide your accent. But again, this is a problem. Because again, during the housing search, one thing is, you can, is when you go in person looking for housing and when you make a phone call. If you have an accent, you may be blocked there because of your accent. On the other side, we have people of color, okay, you speak the language without an accent, on the phone is okay, then you go there to look, to see the house, and just before he opens the door, or if he opens the door, he or she, you will feel there the barrier, and they will not rent the house because of your color scheme. In other words, they will find an excuse or different excuses. Come back 1, 2, 3 days. I've been doing research on that, and the viewers can certainly search some of my publications. Please read it, because the issue of perceived discrimination is there, and the color of your skin, race and ethnicity plays a very important role, but the accent, your accent, also plays an important role, as well as the number of children. This has been the 4 major barriers that people face when they look for housing. Housing is not there, is expensive. We have cities with low vacancy rates, plus you have to deal with all these barriers.
And we've heard that quite a bit from many of our service provider organizations. So a final question for all 3 of you is, how do you see the housing or the rental market in rural and metro areas of BC changing in the next 5, 10, or even 20 years from now? Who would like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I think with the National Housing Strategy, hopefully that will we will see much higher stocks available of rental in the next 5 to 10 years. So that will kind of stabilize the market, a little bit higher vacancy rate, a little bit more options. So a more higher stock, diverse stock, will see more and more of mixed use building where part of it is affordable rental, the rest is market rental. We're seeing more and more of those partnerships, even in smaller communities. So that's a model that's working really well. And a lot of municipalities are now enforcing a certain percentage of the units to be affordable. So hopefully there are a lot more options out there. I don't think a problem can be solved in 5 to 10 years, but definitely there's a lot that's being done to municipal, provincial, federal, nonprofit level to kind of find solutions.
Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, so again, I'll view this question through a legal lens. We'd like to see further changes made to the Residential Tenancy Act, certainly. As I mentioned, with the new government coming into power, some changes have been made and we have momentum now. We'd like to see further amendments. We're facing a rental housing crisis for tenants. The government has a mandate to strengthen renters' protections. So we're going to keep pushing them on that. And specifically, we'd like to see changes made around evictions for landlord's use. So these are the types of no-fault evictions where a landlord is going to move into a tenant's rental unit, move in close family, make extensive renovations, demolish the property. In those situations, a landlord can give a 2-month notice and provide the tenant with 1 month compensation. And we'd like to see increased notice, increased compensation, but also, and this might be the most important part, harsher penalties for landlords who don't follow through with what they said they were going to do on the eviction notice. This is very, very common. There's so much money to be made in tenant turnover nowadays. You may have a tenant with sort of lower rent, and you know you can get much more if you get them out. That landlord can issue a 2-month notice, claim their mother's going to move in, never follow through with that, and face only a 2-month penalty, which they're going to recoup in no time anyways. So we'd like to see a harsher penalty against landlords as more of a deterrent against those practices.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Carlos?
Yes, I am optimistic and pessimistic. Here, it's true the National Housing Strategy will certainly help in this process. But if you look at the case of BC, and particularly Vancouver is not anymore, or is not at the same level as it used to be, the port of entry for immigrants. If you look at Montreal, the city of Toronto, and the city of, they were ports of entry for immigrants. Why? Because one of the ingredients was not only accessibility to jobs, was affordable housing was available. The immigrants, they arrived, different generations of immigrants, they settled in the inner city, they bought cheap housing at the time. In the 50s and 60s, it was easy, relatively easy to buy a house in Hotel de Ville, Sherbrooke for $20,000, or Palmerston Avenue for $30,000, and probably the same thing in Vancouver, but now things changed drastically. So those cities, and the case of Vancouver, the city of Vancouver, it's not anymore this port of entry. Immigrants, they arrive, where do they go? They are going more and more to the suburbs. The case of Richmond. And sometimes immigrants, they are forced to buy because they cannot rent. So when I say I am pessimistic is, since Vancouver is not anymore the port of entry for these immigrants on arrival, they will go further and further away to the suburbs and or the suburbs of Vancouver in search of affordable housing. And they pay a price for doing that as the commuting time, which tends to increase. So in that sense, I'm a little bit pessimistic. I am pessimistic, but I am also optimistic that finally, since the early 90s, we have a strong instrument, a very strong instrument, the National Housing Strategy. I'm quite excited about it, and I have hope that things will change for better.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our presenters today, Andrew, Elizabeth, and Carlos, for bringing your expertise and your passion to the table today. We really appreciate your time. And a big thank you to the AMSSA team for organizing today's event, Sabrina Khan, Julie, and Saida. Thank you very much. We will be emailing everybody an online evaluation form, and we ask that you complete that, as we do rely on the feedback that you provide to plan future events and trainings. And of course, a final note of thanks to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada for funding this event today. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.